WDET is supported by the College of Business Administration at University of Detroit Mercy. UDM's Master of Business Administration is designed to accommodate the career needs of professionals across a variety of work organizations. More information at business.udmercy.edu.
It's the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Nick Austin, flying solo as Tia Graham enjoys a well-deserved week off. Today on the program, Lakeside Mall closed its doors officially this week, and we'll reflect on the memories of the venue as well as why it closed down and what's new for the location in Sterling Heights later this hour. But first, to start off the program, 60 years ago this week, President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law of 1964, saying this.
This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice.
But just why was the act needed, given the Emancipation Proclamation and Reconstruction were supposed to lead to the end of slavery and equal treatment for all? Following the Civil War, both the 14th and 15th Amendments, ratified in 1868 and 1870, were supposed to provide African Americans equal justice under the law. But the enactment of Jim Crow laws and decisions from the Supreme Court like Plessy versus Ferguson created two separate Americas. Remember, looking back, things like movie theaters and schools, drinking fountains were all separated by race, and voting restrictions were created in many states to keep African Americans away from the ballot box. These issues were so stark, Martin Luther King Jr. issued this dire warning about the importance of passing the law.
If this bill is not passed, the ugly sore of racial injustice on the body politic may suddenly turn malignant. And the nation in which we live, the nation that we love, may be inflicted with an incurable cancer that will destroy our political and moral health.
It was slightly more than a year after Dr. King's famous I Have a Dream speech that the 1964 Civil Rights Act came into law. To learn a little bit more about the significance of this legislation, we're joined by Professor Jalila Jefferson Bullock, an associate professor of law at the Wayne State University Law School. Professor Jefferson Bullock, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you. Such a monumental piece of legislation. We often hear about it, and today we're going to tick through some of the elements of it that we don't hear so much about. But before we get into the act itself, let's just set the stage. Can you provide some background about the landscape of civil rights law and the social injustices faced by African Americans that provided the backdrop for this act?
Sure. Well, it's no secret that systemic racism really does exist at every single level of every single tier of our government. It's always been that way. Now, some would push back today and say we live in a colorblind society, but I want us to remember that the Civil Rights Act is only 60 years old, and our country is far older than that. We can begin with bringing over African Americans first as enslaved people. We can move after that to finally freedom that comes in the aftermath of the Civil War, 17 years of Reconstruction, and then which is followed by another 100 years of Jim Crow. So despite the promises of the Civil War amendments, the right to vote free from racial discrimination, the right of equal protection, and all of those things, despite that, states continue to, and in many ways the federal government too, continue to oppress people of color, both legally and socially. The worst part, though, was legally, because it was so difficult to fight that. Finally, by the time we get to 1964, the world, our country, really is in many ways on fire. There's a sense that enough is enough, and people are very serious about fighting to secure their rights and ensuring the guarantees of equality that were promised in the aftermath of the Civil War, and really even at the dawning of our country, right? So in the summer of 1963, you've got the assassination of Medgar Evers. You've got that followed by the March on Washington, the largest demonstration of civil rights at the time. You've got the bombing of Birmingham 16th Street Baptist Church. And you've got, time then, it's the perfect time for change to occur. And finally, after President Kennedy's death, President Lyndon Johnson, with support from civil rights leaders, is able to champion and finally get the Civil Rights Act passed. But I want to say one more thing real quick before your next question.
Please do.
Is that we often forget about Detroit's some of the role that Detroit played, some of it as well. So as I said, people often look at the March on Washington as one of the major catalysts, if you will, although there was so much more that led up to it, for the passage of the Civil Rights Act. But I don't want us to forget about the various walks on freedom that occurred around the country preceding the March on Washington, and one of those happened right in the city of Detroit, principally organized by the late Reverend C.L. Franklin, who was a major civil rights leader in Detroit, the father of singer Aretha Franklin, and others who helped to form the Detroit Council for Human Rights. And so their purpose was to speak out against segregation, raise awareness for employment, housing discrimination. So before even the March on Washington, we had the Detroit Walk to Freedom and various other walks to freedom in other northern cities. So Detroit, along with the rest of the country, helped us set the stage for what will become, one of the major pieces of civil rights legislation in our country, one of the most important.
Well, Professor, if you're trying to cook, I'm going to let you cook. I mean, if we're going into what's happening in Detroit here in terms of the Civil Rights Act and the importance we played here, you mentioned a lot of it, but I'll let you unpack it a little bit more about what are the things you think are significant for people to know about this as a background for what's happening.
Yeah, so what's really important to know, so I want us to set the stage of what's happening today, like in the world. We're in a period right now of kind of intense retrenchment, if you will, where you see legislatively a pushback against many of the freedoms that we've enjoyed for such a long time. So just like kind of then, we're poised now for another, we might even call it a third emancipation. And I hope that does happen in my lifetime, because in many ways we are going backward. But I want us to get to that this landmark legislation, the Civil Rights Act, emerged from a period of intense struggle and intense demand for the fulfillment of the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection, which was never realized before then for people of color, not really for women, certainly not for poor people. And so it's important for us to understand much of that background.
And it is important to bring up that background. You mentioned the other aspects. When we're talking about the Civil Rights Act, it's often coming out in the face of racism and the plight of African Americans. But you mentioned women. I mean, nationality is included in the Civil Rights Act as well. It was really important for enshrining rights for many that were discriminated against in America. So how did the Civil Rights Act itself help change the legal landscape in this country regarding discrimination?
Okay, well, first of all, from a kind of a general point of view, it singularly helped to dismantle Jim Crow laws, which had been in place since 1896 with the Supreme Court decision of Plessy versus Ferguson. What that decision did is it deemed racial segregation constitutional under the separate but equal doctrine, and made racial segregation really the law of the land for another almost 100 years. So what the Civil Rights Act did is it came in and prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. More specifically, it prohibited discrimination in hiring, promoting, firing, and then extended those protections to public accommodations, federally funded programs, and set the stage for other critical legislation like the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's really important. We still do live today, many of our communities are segregated in terms of who attends what public schools and who lives where, but still the Act significantly helps to reduce segregation in Southern schools, which studies show benefits not just African American students, but white students as well. Integration is good for everybody. The Civil Rights Act was followed by many different laws in the 60s and 70s, which expanded the ban against discrimination to include age, to include disability, among others. So the Civil Rights Act initially put in place, we can look at it as a catalyst, a really kind of a consequence, if you will, of all the different demonstrations for racial segregation, for racial equality. But at the same time, though, today, it really helps to ensure equality for all marginalized and minoritized communities.
Yeah, and when we think back, of course, to this legislation, as we're speaking with Professor Jalila Jefferson Bullock, who's a professor again of law at Wayne State University, one of the things that you noted are some of the issues that we still face currently. So are there any emerging issues, specifically gaps in civil rights protection, not addressed by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its progeny and the acts and laws that came after it, that you believe need more specific attention or focus today?
Well, so I'll say this. It's not so much that certain things weren't included in the Civil Rights Act as much as it's become easier and easier to legally outmaneuver the act itself, if you will. And so we can sit around and pretend as if our Supreme Court doles out is a neutral arbiter, if you will, of justice. But think about it, and we consider who is appointed. Those appointees come from certain political parties. We have presidents who appoint based upon political ideology, right? Based upon who they think would best advance their agenda. So there's no way that we can really view, and they're also our justices are people. We can't really view them as neutral arbiters of justice are people who don't see anything but what the law says and try to apply it. Everyone's got an ideology. Everyone's got a motivation. And so what we see now is the legal sanctioning through judicial interpretation of watering down of voting rights. We saw it really significantly in 2013 when Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, that was the enforcement mechanism, which would allow for pre-clearance for bad actors, right, for states who had shown that they use discriminatory practices over and over again. Before Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, the rule was that those bad actors had to have any voting changes pre-cleared by the federal government before they became final law. And Shelby County versus Holder gutted that requirement such that you saw even in the aftermath, the day after, multitudes of states, legislators and states filing bills that were otherwise would have been had been in the past deemed discriminatory because you didn't have that pre-clearance mechanism in place. So those are the types of things. It's not that voting wasn't covered. It's that once people change, once things shift on the court, once the law is viewed differently, that sometimes the protections that were originally foreseen by that legislation, they're not afforded in the same manner as was originally conceived. And so that's what we see. We see that in voting. Yeah. We see it in the diluting of DEI initiatives and the demonizing of diversity, equity, inclusion. We see it in affirmative action and its dismantling. We see it even as it relates to poor women in abortion cases. We see it all over the place. So in the case of voting, we actually have less protection today than we had in the aftermath of the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which is, of course, a consequence of the Civil Rights Act. Because
right. Professor, I do need to jump in just a little bit because I don't want to lose you before we get the last question. I know that we're time limited in the segment, but one of the things, especially hearing from you, bringing up the need to realize that our laws are enacted by people. It's important who the judges are. It's important who's writing the legislation. It's important who we're voting for, putting in office, so that these rules, you can put them on paper, but if they're not enforced, as you're getting at, it doesn't really mean anything. So for you then, as we work towards closing out the segment, what is the legacy of the Civil Rights Act of 1964?
Well, again, it did put into place some of the most sweeping pieces of legislation related to equality that we've ever seen in this country. And so what it did was attempt to begin the process. It's a long process of putting marginalized people on equal footing with people who would be considered in the majority of our country. So I would say that's what it did. It gave us kind of a compass, if you will, by which we should consider equality and justice under the law. And it opened up many, many doors to people who otherwise would not have had them. Is the work that we'd like to do done? Not at all. Not at all. We've never really fully lived up to the promises of America, but we've never walked away from them either. And that is what the Civil Rights Act does. It gives us a promise and a vehicle through which we can still work to secure some of our most fundamental civil liberties and our most fundamental rights and make them a reality for every American.
Professor Jalila Jefferson Bullock, Associate Professor of Law at the Wayne State University Law School. We'll have to end it there, but thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you.
It is the Metro on 1019 WDET, and later this hour, we're going to hear about the closing of Lakeside Mall, but we also want to hear from you about it. What's your favorite mall memory? Is your mall that you hang out with still around? Do you have any ideas on what should happen with the land after it closes? There is a project that's currently in place, but what do you think should occur? What should you see there? Give us a call, 313-577-1019. Again, 313-577-1019. We might be able to work you into that conversation. That's coming up a little bit later, but as I mentioned, Taco Fest is coming to Royal Oak starting tomorrow. We'll hear about the event when we return.
WDET is supported by the College of Business Administration at the University of Detroit Mercy. UDM is offering a new Master of Science degree in ethical leadership focused on sustainable, ethical, and inclusive problem solving. Admission is open to qualified applicants with a bachelor's degree in any field. Course selection is flexible, with no prerequisites, 4 required courses, and 6 electives. Learn more at business.udmercy.edu.
Here at Shortwave Space Camp, we escape our everyday lives to explore the mysteries and quirks of the universe. We find weird, fun, interesting stories that explain how the cosmos is partying all around us. From stars to dwarf planets to black holes and beyond, we've got you. Listen now to the Shortwave Podcast from NPR.
It's the Metro on 1019 WDET, where we ask the tough questions like, who doesn't love a taco? Really tough one there. Handmade, soft shell, hard shell, corn, flour, tortilla. You got so many options, but whatever you do, it's going to be good eating. And this holiday, you can bring the fourth in with music, lucha libre wrestling, and of course, tacos at this year's Royal Oak Taco Fest. It's going down July 4th through July 7th, and taco enthusiasts can try all kinds of local restaurants, partake in live music, and learn more about Latinx culture. To learn more about the event and what's going down there, we're joined by John Witz, the producer of the Royal Oak Taco Fest. John, thank you for joining us on the Metro.
It's great to be here, and I am ready for your hard questions or your hard shells. Either way, we are ready to go. And thank you so much for letting us share kind of the major event for people that are going to be in town this weekend. We'll be ready for you.
Yeah, well, you got to watch it with the hard shells, John, because I got a bit of an arm on me, man, so you might be biting off a little more you can chew. Hard shells, not so aerodynamic, but better for eating. How long has this event been going on in Royal Oak, John?
Well, it's a rise to the top story. This is only our 3rd year, and we've averaged, even with some tough weather last year, 60,000 people. We had such a big turnout the first year. There was actually too many people, so we changed our venue, made it a little bigger, added some more trucks, and we now really have the perfect spot. More than 50 trucks and eateries will be throughout downtown on the east side of Main Street around Centennial Commons. So it's only been 3 years. We continue to adjust, and we become a fan favorite for 4th of July. You normally don't think tacos, but yes.
Oh, why not? Come on, tacos. But why tacos, right? Like, of all the things that you could be getting into, why did you choose tacos to be the event for this?
Well, I wish I had a story other than, just kind of the people's choice. A longtime friend, who was involved in marketing at a media publication, had done a taco fest, and he said, we got to try one in Royal Oak, and brought it to my attention, and we gave it a go, and the success was incredible. And I think we're just following the fact that it's, a people's favorite, and we were certainly, proven right with the turnout. And, again, we certainly, as you mentioned in the intro, try and do more than just tacos. There's tequila sipping, frozen margaritas, strolling mariachi bands, 4 stages really of entertainment and strolling performers on stilts or juggling fire or, just the idea of having a fun street festival and lots for the family. And it's one of the great values of the event when, taking your kids, they can do the inflatables for free or get a free face painting or free arts and crafts. So once you pay that admission fee, there's a lot of value in it. So we're excited about the lineup of entertainment, and it's more than tacos for sure.
Yeah, well, that is interesting. But what I think is also intriguing, if I'm going to go in there, is what's the diversity of tacos I will have? Like, how many businesses are we talking about? Because, if I just keep getting the same taco and over again, that might get a little boring. So,
well, for sure. And I think Southwest Detroit is well represented. Galindo's, will be there. Salinas will be there. Senor Taco. We have other taco trucks from around town. The whole enchilada truck will be there. It's vegan. Will be doing tacos. Taco El Rodeo. Real Taco Express will have 2 tacos there. Nepantla Cafe has a brick and mortar coming soon to Detroit. There's going to be doing vegan tacos as well. Imperial Tacos from Ferndale. So it's a great lineup. And what we've also done, because it's 4th of July, we bring in some barbecue too, just in case. We have the House of Barbecue will be there. Lockhart's will be there. Table number 2. From Detroit will be there. And even Cousins Maine Lobster will be doing lobster tacos. So, we'll have a lot of different flavors. So I promise if you come on multiple days and you do lunch and dinner, you will still have, at least 8 different experiences that you can put on those taste buds.
We're chatting with John Witz, producer of the Royal Oak Taco Fest. And John, I heard rumors that there's actually going to be Lucha Libre wrestling at this event also. As someone who did watch a little bit of wrestling back in the day, don't tell anybody. Is this true? What's leading to that? You gonna put me in the ring? What's happening?
You talked about the guns you carry, on the arms there. So, we certainly can put there in there. We would just ask that someone on your marketing team designs a cool WDET mask for you to wear and turns you into, I think you can, have a voting rights cape and stand up for, what's right in this country and then also have some fun in the ring. But
working on my finishing move now, but go ahead.
Yes. So it has become a fan favorite. We did it our first year, and I don't think folks really care whether they think it's real or not real or any of that. People just have a blast. The wrestlers are very acrobatic. They interact with the crowd. They're in colorful costumes and masks, and it's just that, again, that culture, that Latin culture of wrestling is brought in, and people have just loved it. Our crowds for the 3 wrestling events a day in the championship, that occurs at the end have just been, wildly significant. We actually were telecast on a Fox News blog nationally last year. So they came, not Fox News, Fox Sports rather. So, it was just really well attended and enjoyed, and lots of smiles, laughs, and, some excitement too when someone's getting flipped 2 times and lands on their back from 20 feet in the air.
I'm telling you, it can get pretty intense.
It does, but it's been a favorite. I'm glad you brought it up. It's just one of the fun things that we do. We have a taco eating contest from Condados. We have a Kroger's Taco Twosome contest where you have to make and eat tacos as a twosome, and that's going to be fun. We have a pet parade contest where you'll see dogs dressed as tacos. So, we have a lot of different fun things. We just try and keep it fresh and fun, and so, it's just more than, coming down to Nosh that you can, enjoy some fun experiences and see some cool things in the process.
Cool. What's the best way for people to find out more about the event?
Well, I will tell you a couple things. One, it's RoyalOakTacoFest.com, but There's a special on tickets until 3 o'clock. We just extended it. So it's $8 in advance if you buy your tickets, and you can get them right through the website. And it goes up to 12 after 3 and throughout every day. Parking is really much easier than they say in Royal Oak. There's 4,500 parking spaces. And just a tip, the 2 parking decks on Lafayette are free all day Thursday and all day Sunday due to the holiday. So it's only a 3-block walk to park there. There's $10 parking closer. There's $5 parking 2 blocks away. So there's, value in the parking, very easy to find a space. The meters are at their regular price, but they're also free tomorrow and free Sunday. So great value on tickets, parking, and we're right in downtown Royal Oak, easy to find.
All right, John Witz, producer of the Royal Oak Taco Fest, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you.
It is the Metro on 101.9 WDET. Hey, in about 15 minutes, we're going to talk about the closing of Lakeside Mall and what it means for the area, but we want to hear from you. Do you have any favorite memories from the mall, or is your favorite mall still around? What do you think is the future of malls, and what should happen to the area? What would you like to see there when the mall is closed? Give us a call, 313-577-1019. We'll have that conversation in about 15 minutes, but coming up, we're going to get into some more information you need to know. Keep it locked right here as the Metro continues. It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET. DET representing Detroit and the Motor City and Motown, because we all know about Detroit's incredible music history. Certainly it's no secret, but do we truly know all of it? What about the music performed and recorded at venues that no longer exist? In this episode of Curiosity, Rob Reinhardt answers a listener's question about a forgotten Detroit jazz club, 46 Selden.
I'm Rob Reinhardt, and in this latest episode of Curiosity, we tackle a question close to my heart and yours. And yep, it's about music. And the question comes from Peter Pasquay.
Detroit has a rich musical history. What important venues of past and present should every Detroiter know about?
Well, Pete, Detroit certainly has perhaps the richest musical history of any city in America. Genres from techno to jazz to garage rock, famed record labels from Motown to Westbound to Third Man, and all the artists from Smokey to Seeger, Aretha to Aaliyah, from MC5 to SRC to ICP. If you wanted to see live music in this town for not that much money, there was a venue to suit your musical taste. Maybe you wanted to see Proof hosting a freestyle battle. The Hip Hop Shop on 7 Mile was the place to be.
We a family to stay together. Yeah, we don't pray together, but this house gonna be every day forever. Love letters.
Maybe you were more into Black Flag or Negative Approach. You could head over to Clutch Cargoes or Greystone Hall.
Rise above, we're gonna rise above.
In the 60s and early 70s, something different, or the Chalet might have SRC, Frost, or Brownsville Station.
Smoking in the boys' room.
And even earlier, the 20 Grand opened in 1953 as a home for the blues, but by the 1960s, that's where you'd find the people who would become Motown legends.
Money don't get everything, is true.
But perhaps you've noticed something about all those venues, and many more, like Center Stage in Canton, Ann Arbor's Canterbury House, Klein's Show Bar, and the Bluebird and Latin Quarters. They're all long gone.
Hey, Detroit! Yeah!
Even the big venues, the Palace of Auburn Hills, Pontiac Silverdome, Cobo Hall, Joe Louis Arena, Olympia, they've all vanished. But a few have had their history preserved, which brings us back to Pete Pasquay and the reason behind his question.
I was listening to Charles Mingus's 46 Selden. Found out that it was called the Strata Concert Gallery, and it was only open for a short period of time, but there are a lot of cool jazz musicians that went through there. I'd like to learn more about which one should I know about, and I want to go find some records that were recorded at these venues and listen to them, you know?
So let's look at this particular album that Pete was listening to, and what you're hearing now. Charles Mingus, Jazz in Detroit, Strata Concert Gallery, 46 Selden. The Strata Concert Gallery started on Michigan Avenue in Corktown, but moved to the location at 46 Selden. Strata was the brainchild of pianist Kenny Cox, drummer Bud Spangler, and trumpeter Charles Moore. They've all passed away now, but in the late 60s, Ken Cox rounded up financial support from the Michigan Council of the Arts to start Strata. One of the others there at the start of Strata Concert Gallery, guitarist Ron English, who is still playing and teaching around Metro Detroit, filled in some details about those few precious years at 46 Selden.
They were in the context of what we understood to be necessary, which was audience development. It was spearheaded really by Ken Cox and Charles Moore, two composing principals in the CJQ, Contemporary Jazz Quintet.
As psychedelic art rock was starting to gain traction, the group at Strata wanted to make sure jazz held its ground for both local and national artists.
The other piece was audience development for those of us who were Detroit artists. Wendell Harrison had been in New York. He'd come back to Detroit. Phil Ranlin came here from, I think, by way of Indianapolis. Harold McKinney was a godfather to all of us. Marcus Belgrave were involved in educational operation directly across the street where the High School for Performing Arts is now, and that was called Metro Arts Complex. Students and would come across the street and hear their teachers, that group, and the CJQ, I think the Lyman Woodard organization, and others that performed there.
So 46 Selden was all about building an audience and jazz education. But what about Pete Pasquale's Mingus album? Well, there's been a resurgence of interest as more tapes from Strata have surfaced. There's now a compilation of those recordings called DJ Amir Presents Strata Records, The Sound of Detroit Volume 1, that features Larry Nazzaro, Kenny Cox, the CJQ, and the Lyman Woodard Organization, featuring Ron English on guitar, which you're hearing now. The recordings at Strata were made possible when the Strata Corporation purchased a recording truck that they could pull into the back of 46 Selden.
Started as a 4-track, and we recorded the trio, the basic tracks. We sweetened it with, horn overdubs and Mellotron string overdubs by transferring those 4 tracks to the 16-track in the truck.
So where does one buy a used 16-track mobile recording truck in 1973?
That is the truck that had been owned by Steve Gebhardt.
Which brings another interesting twist to the Strata Gallery story. Steve Gebhardt was a filmmaker. In 1970, Gebhardt started working for Joko Films. Joko was John and Yoko, as in John Lennon and Yoko Ono.
This song I wrote for John Sinclair.
In 1971, Yoko asked him to record the film and audio at what came to be known as the 10 for 2 concert, where John and Yoko and many others gathered at Chrysler Arena to help free poet, activist, and MC5 band manager John Sinclair.
It ain't fair, John Sinclair, in the staff all breathing hell.
Sinclair was being held in prison for possessing 2 joints. Shortly after the concert, he was released. The mobile recording van at that concert became Strata's recording studio at 46 Selden.
I remember driving out to New York with a friend. I drove my car back, and he drove that van back from New York City.
And after Sinclair was released from jail,
what I felt then was, how am I going to make a living? I had 2 small children. I was a publicly branded troublemaker and bad guy. How am I going to make a living?
And as he told Ann DeLisi back in 2020, he found a place for himself at 46 Selden.
I came back here and I asked my friends at Strata Gallery and Strata Records, Ken Cox, Charles Moore was my best friend and mentor. And I asked them if I could have a desk in their space, and in return I would do work on their records and whatever they needed for publicity and stuff like that.
John went to work for Strata, producing concerts and albums for Strata Records through the end of the 1970s. Again, Ron English.
In that 73-74 season, we had Ornette Coleman, Charles Mingus, Herbie Hancock, and the M1 Sheet Band. And again, that was taped, I think, probably by WDET.
Oh, and then there's that. The Strata Concert Gallery at 46 Selden had another cool feature. It served as a performance space for live radio broadcasts right here on WDET.
I'm Bud Spangler. I'm on Monday nights from 9 until 1 o'clock.
In addition to being a great drummer and promoter of music in Detroit, Bud was also a broadcaster. Besides the Charles Mingus album Pete Pasquale was listening to, many other artists visiting 46 Selden were also being broadcast live on the air at WDET, where Bud, Ken Cox, and Charles Moore all had radio programs. And a good bit of fun.
Will you leave me alone? I'm trying to do a radio program.
And even though the venue and many of the people are gone now, some things stay the same.
Your contributions, tax deductible, to WDET FM.
Thanks for the great question, Pete. We hope you found out more about that Charles Mingus album you have.
I look forward to learning more. I'm glad you guys took the question.
And the Detroit venue where it was recorded.
46 Selden, Strata Concert Gallery. Good night, folks.
For Curiosity, I'm Rob Reinhardt.
Thank you, WDET's Rob Reinhardt, for that story and Curiosity. It's produced by Amanda LeClaire. You can listen to that episode and the whole catalog of Curiosities on your podcast of choice podcast app. For all of those burning questions, though, that you have about Detroit, ask us. WDET.org/curious. This is the Metro. And all that talk of jazz has me thinking of the historic places that we enjoy jazz here in Detroit, such as the Bluebird Inn. It makes you think, if only these walls could talk. Music started being performed at the nightclub in the 1930s, and over the years, it became a premier curator of modern jazz in the city. We're talking the likes of John Coltrane, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, Elvin Jones, and many, many more legendary musicians who performed at the Bluebird Inn. Well, the Detroit Sound Conservancy, a nonprofit archiving Detroit's music and cultural history, acquired the building in 2019. Thanks to a $1.9 million grant from the Mellon Foundation, the group is inching closer to music and community returning to the space. To talk about the next chapter of the Bluebird Inn, we're joined by the Detroit Sound Conservancy co-directors, I should say, Michelle Jara McKinney, as well as Jonah Radins Silverstein. Thank you both for joining us. Stein.
You got it.
You know, it's like Berenstein, Bears. But you know what?
Works.
I'm glad you're here for me. Look, we are really excited about the future of what's going to be happening with this space. You know, I did mention the history of some of the legends that happened there. It's such a historic space. I do want to know from you guys, what are the plans now that these funds are coming in?
Well, we have a community. It's getting that community reactivated and re-energized around the Bluebird Inn, especially as archives. We do all genre of music. Detroit has never had archives like this.
Okay.
And so we're going to get that archives active and have the collections accessible. We're going to have collaborations with different community groups that are going to be working out of that Bluebird Inn with us. You know, they are definitely in our purview, you know, all of them. We're talking to them now.
Yeah. And, you know, I jumped into that pretty quickly, but I guess the question really is, what are the plans for this space now that you have it?
Sure. Well, like you said, we purchased the building in 2019, but in many ways, the project of the Bluebird goes hand in hand with that of Detroit Sound Conservancy. So in 2012, the first time a group of people met up to even think of what an organization dedicated to Detroit music history could look like, that meetup happened outside the Bluebird Inn. So it was a dream. It was an idea of what it could mean to really advocate for Detroit music history. So the plans are to bring back the Bluebird as a music venue, like Michelle said, as a music archive. So what we're doing is we're bringing back the venue space, the bar space, to kind of reinstall the historic stage that we had salvaged a number of years ago and has toured around the city. And in the back of that building will be an archival space. So it's kind of going to be a hybrid modular space that really will be dedicated to Detroit music and Detroit's cultural history vis-a-vis cultural programming and community engagement.
You know, if I think about this, Michelle, from what you were talking about, it does seem like Detroit Sound Conservancy is a good steward for this. What is it for you that you're able to achieve now with this new building and this grant coming in you weren't able to before? What has you excited about this project?
Well, we will have a actual physical place where people can come in, ask for the collections. We'll have an online presence where people can see what we have, and they can actually come in and access it. I'm talking about teachers and the students. We're right across the street from a school. Anyone who is interested in the Detroit music and its impact and its legacy. And I'm hoping I'm getting these musicians to come in, and I'm calling y'all right now that I expect that you will bring your collections in there so that 100 years from now, people will know you and see what you have done. So that is what is so exciting to me about this building, is that we're going to have this place to house and have people have access to these collections.
We've been thinking about like libraries, the ability to access physical media, the ability to have a place to get all of this history in one location. Making it easy for folks would be important, but we also kind of want to know, when does this start? What's the timeline that we're looking at right now when it comes to getting this off the ground?
Well, like I said, I mean, it started over 10 years ago. Yeah. So, but what we're looking at is the fall of next year. We're hoping to have the doors open of the building, and that's seeming pretty realistic for us right now. I mean, we can't promise anything, but we're hoping. We have an annual barbecue every year, so September 15th of this year, we've had live music and celebration outside the Bluebird, and we're hoping that's September 15th of this year, which will still be outside, but that time next year of 2025 is when we're hoping to have that at least somewhat inside by then.
Right. Is there any requirements, by the way, for me to get my music on there, right? Just being from Detroit, are we talking like out to Ann Arbor? Do I have to be good? Can I give you some of my old polka music, or does that not fit? Tell me.
Oh, I'm talking about the greater metropolitan area, Ann Arbor, Flint, all of it, Lansing, yeah.
So what's the best way for people to learn more and track your progress so they know when to
Well, the easiest way is to go to our website, DetroitSound.org, or find us on social media, Detroit Sound, kind of Instagram, Facebook. And, just keep following along. Join our newsletter, and we keep the public posted. And, we're always looking for folks to join in the project, either as donors for collections, or as volunteers, or as donors, financial donors, to kind of contribute to this work as well. So a lot of ways to get involved, and the first place to start would be DetroitSound.org.
All right, Detroit Sound Conservancy co-directors Jonah Radins-Silverstein and Michelle Jara
there you go.
McKinney.
Perfect.
Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you,
on
Nick.
The Metro.
It's been a pleasure.
It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET. Lakeside Mall closed this week, and we're going to reflect on it, but we want you to join in. In fact, we got some callers already lined up, but what are your memories from the mall, and what do you think about malls generally? What's the future of mall spaces here in the area? Give us a call, 313-577-1019, and we'll be back to discuss with you when we return on the Metro. It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET, and after nearly a half century of operating in Sterling Heights, Lakeside Mall closed its doors for good. We recall it opening up back in 1976, becoming one of those destination areas in the state, having so many experiences, even Michigan's first indoor tubular water slide. But like many malls across the country, facing difficulties in the modern climate, it did close its doors. So we want to reflect not only on the location, but also what the future of the space brings. We're doing it with you as well by calling 313-577-1019 to share your memories. But to help us reflect, we're joined by JC Reindl, who's a business reporter for the Detroit Free Press. JC, welcome to Metro.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so let's start with you, man. Do you have any favorite memories of Lakeside Mall? What stands out to you from the heyday?
Yeah, I did not grow up in the area, but I visited the mall a couple of times, usually for reporting trips, back when it was one of the healthier malls in Metro Detroit. And back then, as a reporter, a good rule of thumb is the healthier the mall, the greater the chance you're going to be kicked out of the mall if you're trying to report in the mall. And so I had that issue before, but the last couple of weeks, when in the final weeks of Lakeside Mall, did not get kicked out.
Yeah,
a lot of people are doing their farewell tours.
Well, I think they were looking for more people to come to the mall at that point in time. But JC, one of the things that you were able to do was look into some of the unique features and attractions the mall had. You also got a chance to see some surveys from back in the mid-1980s. What did you learn from looking into the location?
Yeah, a lot of people have strong emotional connections to Lakeside Mall. There wasn't really a downtown in Sterling Heights. So it really was a center of gravity for the community. A lot of people hung out there when they were teenagers. All the shopping was done there. They had a lot of attractions. They had a water slide from the mid-'80s, I think, into the '90s. There's been a couple ice skating rinks there throughout the years. So a lot more than just a collection of shops. There was arcades.
That's what I always loved about it, the arcades. But, there are people around here who have fond memories, including Brent in Livonia. Brent, go ahead. You are on the Metro.
Hello. My fondest memory of going to the malls is growing up as a kid. Every year at the end of summer, get to go back to school shopping. My mom would always take me, and we'd always end the shopping day with a cinnamon sugar pretzel from the mall.
Oh, my gosh. Such a memory. Brent, you're reminding me when my mom had to get me to JCPenney and I didn't want to go, or the mall. This was Northland. They used to have these pastries that she would get me, a croissant. So that's how I got my little French delicatessen. And you give me the croissant, I'm yours for the next 5 hours. So that's awesome. Brent, thank you for sharing that memory with us as we move to Taylor in Livonia. Taylor, go ahead. You're on the Metro.
Hi, how are you?
Doing well. What is your memories of the mall and Lakeside or malls generally?
Well, I'm a Gen Zer, so I'm a little young, but just going to the mall and hanging out with my friends, or even having a mom drop us off at the mall, having someone else's mom pick us up. It's just not the same anymore. So it's just weird going into a mall and it's kind of like a ghost town or on the verge of closing or is closing. So it's just kind of sad to see that.
Yeah, it is interesting. They used to be these kind of hub spaces for people if you wanted to be part of the community, go around, check out people who were young as well, where they're going to be at the mall. And JC, what were some of the reasons why this isn't the case anymore? Malls used to be hubs for us, but now it seems like it's less so. What did you find out in looking into this?
Yeah, in this particular mall, it seems like what really did it in was obviously online shopping. As a lot of malls have suffered because of that, but also with the Partridge Creek, that open-air shopping center that opened around 2007. That did, initially you had some stores that might have had two locations, one at Lakeside and then one at the new Partridge Creek, but then over time, more stores are shifting to Partridge Creek, more the upper tier. And so that also really, really took a toll on Lakeside. Yeah. And then COVID too. You did see more mall walkers and visitors, before the pandemic. And a lot of the business owners that have still in the mall, been there for decades, they did notice a drop-off that never quite returned after the pandemic.
Yeah, well, Taylor, I do appreciate your memory, so thank you so much for that. And, when we talk about this new open-air space, I think it is interesting that we do see what future malls seem to be looking like. What is planned for the Lakeside site in the future?
Yeah, they're looking to do a Lakeside Town Center, which would be open-air. In a couple phases, and they hope to break ground late in 2025. And there would be some apartments. There would be some new retail, the drive-up retail, not traditional walk-into a mall type retail, some office space even, a hotel, and a lot of open space, like park space there.
This seems interesting to me. It seems like there's this move now to, instead of having dedicated malls, like creating these multifaceted venues. Because what I'm hearing from you is residential space, office space, grassy spaces. I've seen people doing yoga where there's shopping centers nearby. I worry about too much commercialization of my personal or work life. But is this what the future of malls is from what you've seen?
I think it depends on the site. The Northland Mall, remember that mall, they're building a lot of housing there, kind of similar to what is envisioned for the future Lakeside Town Center. But then you look at other once dead malls like Eastland Mall, and they're not going to do the housing and mixed use approach. They're looking more at the industrial big box like North Point, which puts in they build facilities for auto suppliers. So it really depends on the location of the mall. Some like Northland and Lakeside, it makes more sense to have consumer focused successor to the traditional mall, but others, like Eastland, they're going straight industrial.
All right. Well, then what's the future then of malls? Are they viable business options in your opinion, based on what you're seeing? Can Southeast Michigan sustain these kind of new malls moving forward, or is this a dying industry?
Yeah, I don't have a crystal ball, but my gut tells me that there will always be a market for some malls. Yeah. Somerset seems like it's doing fairly well. And I think people still want to go someplace physical and shop. It's covered. You can kind of go there year round. But we're obviously not going to have as many malls as we did in say, 1985.
Yeah. The heyday of the mall when you could get down there, get your video game on. For me, one of the reasons why you'd have to go to the mall, the video game experience was so much better than you would have at home. Now, not so much, of course, with modern technology, but so many interesting things to do with these spaces. I guess in the reporting that you've done through this, JC, and we got like 30 seconds, but just what's the big takeaway that you've had from reflecting on the closure of Lakeside?
Yeah, I think a lot of these malls like Lakeside, it was not just a collection of shops, or, people had a very emotional connection to the mall. There's a lot of nostalgia. Just so many memories. This was just a place you would hang out, kind of like the 1950s small town America. Downtown is what these malls were for a lot of the suburban communities.
Yeah. All right. Well, JC Reindl, business reporter with the Detroit Free Press, thank you so much for joining us and help us reflect on the closure of Lakeside Mall.
Thank you for having me.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Metro. Tomorrow is Independence Day, so we'll be taking the day off, but we'll air a special program from NPR hosted by Steve Inskeep. We the Voters, Issues That Matter. So you make sure to keep it locked right here through the weekend. We will be back on Friday as you are listening to WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. We'll talk again on Friday, but see you right here with Steve Inskeep on Thursday.
WDET is supported by the College of Business Administration at University of Detroit Mercy. UDM is offering a new master's degree in ethical leadership focused on sustainable, ethical, and inclusive problem solving. More information at business.udmercy.edu.